Welcome back to our lesson on the theology of music. Martin Luther famously said that next to theology, music was the most important discipline because it would get you closer to God. I think I agree with him. Music's power is something else for us, isn't it? You can think about the music of your youth, even though you're still young, you can remember music from your early childhood, the music that you listened to in high school and that came out when you were in college and then when you're an early adult. They will give you nostalgia. They will take you back, transport you in time back to the feelings that you had. We're all moved by music, and sometimes we don't even care about the words of the song. The music itself moves us. And when we think about the letter eight, or the number eight, as we've talked about a few times already, eight having the sense of eternity. We have the 3+4, the completeness, the 7-day work week, and then we have this elusive eighth day. This is the extension of the Sabbath rest, the seventh day, into the new kingdom, the resurrected kingdom of Jesus Christ. And not all music is this way, but in Western music, music's in an octave, and it's not something that we came up with. In fact, sometimes if you try to put music into like 10s or 12s, there seems to be some dissonance. Not necessarily that it's wrong, and there's other cultures that do this, that's fine. But it is something that the natural way we think about music is an octave. It's an eight. And so there is just something beyond just the physical here when we think about music. And I think that's something that we should think about when we think about church music. Now, different denominations are going to think historically about music in a different way. So let's say in Western culture, or the Western church, I should say, music in the Roman Catholic Church, again in the medieval period, was something that was done by the professionals. It was something done by the professionals, and that meant that it was professional. There would be these beautiful chants. It develops into requiem masses that were done by these great classical artists from the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. The Reformation, however, really put congregational singing as one of the most important things of the worship service. So the Lutheran style is to sing, have the people sing. Early radical Protestants were against singing, just like they were against artwork and stuff like that. That was something that was physical. That was something that was bad. We can even sort of kind of get a feel of that still today, that music corrupts our youth, rock and roll, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and that kind of stuff. And yet I think the Protestant world has come back to the idea of the power of singing for the people. But today we see a movement towards, again, professional singers, kind of like the church band sort of thing. And so then church becomes passive for the regular person. It becomes even almost kind of an entertainment thing. So think about those in the back of your mind. The different denominations do think about music in a different way. Lutherans were always known as the singing church. Roman Catholics had good hymnody, but often would be a professional choir, a liturgical choir. Protestants, for a while, were kind of against singing, only simple chant of psalms. But then there was an explosion of hymnody especially in the English Protestant world. But now it's developed again to kind of the professional band sort of thing. Okay, so what are the benefits of music? Well, let's think about, first of all, the octave again, that symbolism there, getting close to the idea of God. But there's education, isn't there? When you were in kindergarten, you learned stuff by singing a song, right? And so when you memorize, it's easier to memorize words when they're set to music. And so hymns, if you went to a parochial school where you had to memorize hymns, I didn't, but much of my family did. You know that faith because it's tattooed on your heart, because it was set to music, and there's nothing better than having a piece of music that fits just perfectly with the words, which is kind of a difficult thing to do. So education is a big one. I think there's propaganda, and propaganda can be a negative thing, but we could sort of understand this as a good thing too, that you're sending a message out with music, right? This is the power of advertising, the power of a national anthem, those kinds of things. Music can also get people involved in the church service. It adds a certain sense of beauty. And so we can think about all of these benefits of music. And throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Jewish people and then the Christian church have been really about music, maybe in a way that no other religion or philosophy really has been about. The people sing. The people sing because they're optimists. Christians are optimists and full of joy because we know that we have a bright future. And so why not sing? And at the same time, singing is not just about joy and happiness. We also have to sing our blues. We have to sing our funeral dirges. And that's something that we don't really do in our modern American church scene. We want everything to be peppy and upbeat. But think about some of the music that is attracted to you that you're attracted to in a secular way. There's sad songs. Sometimes sad songs tell us something. And so it is meaningful for us to have music that isn't always peppy and entertaining, that we maybe don't always like on a surface level, but it says something about the passion of Christ and about the compassion we should have for those who suffer. Now, there are different dangers in music. We're going to come back to the different genres and styles for a second, but there can be dangers. One danger is when the music trumps the words of the song. So think about the pop songs that you're attracted to. You're attracted to it because of the tune. And sometimes you don't even know what the words mean, or you don't even know what the words are that are actually said, right? We can play this game where we take a piece of music and we ask people what the words are, and we can come up with hilarious results when people thought that what they were hearing was not exactly what the lyrics really were. And so if the music trumps the words, then we have a problem, right? Then it's just only emotion. But you want the emotion tied to something objective, right? And so the words of a hymn need to be clear. They need to be doctrinally sound. They need to say something in order for it to have a true spiritual benefit. Now, here's a question that's a little bit difficult. Can music ever be neutral? I don't think it can be. There was an idea in the previous generation that the styles of music didn't matter. So you could take whatever style you want, throw some Christian lyrics in it, and it was just going to be fine. But I think that's insulting to the musicians. Certain genres give you a feeling, right? Each of these genres in front of you say something, right? Rock and roll is about freedom. It's about rebellion. It is thoroughly American, even though it has its roots in some other places. It's thoroughly American youth and rebellion and freedom and doing what you want. Does that style match up with the Christian doctrine? I'm not quite sure it always does. I'm not saying we can't pull things from that genre. I'm not saying that you can't use it. I'm just saying just be weary of that a little bit. And I think, by the way, it's better, instead of taking a style and throwing some Jesus lyrics in it and just calling it a day, that becomes a little bit cheap, and it's quite frankly insulting to the style, right? Now this is old man get off my lawn thing, so I may offend you, but I'm against Christian rock and roll, not because it's bad theology, although it often is, but because it's bad rock and roll. Rock and roll is something that is different than the Christian message. It's fine, it's great, but it's something different. I think it's better to have for instance, if we're going to stick with this example of rock and roll, it's better not to have Christian rock and roll, but to have rock and roll that happens to be Christian. And what I mean by that is this: don't try to force a round peg into a square hole, but rather, if you're in a secular space and you are a rock and roll artist, there are certain spiritual things that could naturally come up, but they come up organically. They're not necessarily used for a worship service, but they are still a proclamation of the gospel out in the world. I can think about Bono and U2. I know I'm dating myself a little bit, but he's a strong Christian, and there are themes that get played out in his music, but he's not trying to make rock and roll Christian. I think it's kind of a bad look for people outside of the church looking in when they go, that's a little bit cheap, that you're just trying to change rock and roll to be Christian. You're going to reach people by talking about the human condition through that genre in a much more powerful way. Music can never be neutral. So you can think about like rap or R&B. I personally know Christian rap artists. But this is also telling a story. It's telling a story usually of injustice. It's telling a story of a community that can naturally play out into spiritual themes. But is that the correct way to worship? Is that the best way to worship? I'm not quite sure. I think we can debate about it. And so the different genres in front of you, each of them have a feeling. Can they organically talk about spiritual things? Absolutely. But if you force it too much, you lose the power of the genre, and I think you lose credibility with the world as well. So let's talk about benefits of different, not just styles, but different kinds of music that we use in the church. Chant is actually a beautiful thing. That may seem very archaic to you, but chant is beautiful because it's really tied to the words. So think about a text of the Bible that you're familiar with. Let's say John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, when I speak those words, I am automatically putting my meaning upon the words, even if I'm just saying the words. So notice the inflection of my voice. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What am I emphasizing there? I'm emphasizing the Word, Jesus, is God. And yet, I think I missed something there. Maybe the emphasis should be on in the beginning. So if I would say it this way, in the beginning was the Word, then I'm emphasizing in the beginning. And if you are familiar at all with the Bible, the beginning of John's gospel is corresponding to the beginning of the Bible itself in Genesis, because those are the first words of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so by my inflection of my voice, I'm always giving you my sort of what I think is important. Chant is something that fights against that. And so very often you'll see, especially in the Roman Catholic Church and Orthodox churches, you'll see whole texts that are chanted. So the in the beginning was the Word, and the Word, that would be chanted on Christmas Day. That's the gospel reading for Christmas Day. When you have chant, you have maybe one note, and at the end of the line, it goes up and down. And those notes do not correspond with the words, so that the words themselves all have equal value. Now, if I would try to read to you John chapter 1 without putting any inflection in my voice, so that I didn't put my meaning or what I think is important as the speaker of it on that text, this would be a very boring way to listen. I would say, in the beginning was the Word. But if you add that to chant, and you chant that, the words themselves all have equal value. So instead of monotonely trying to give each word equal value, in the beginning, the chant does it in a beautiful way. So if you ever listen to a chant of a very familiar biblical text to you, I can almost guarantee that that text will be opened up to you in a completely different way, because you don't have the inflection of your own voice as you read it, or the voice in your memory of the person who spoke it to you, but the chant the chant gives every word value in a beautiful way. But chant is difficult and it can be a little bit so there are drawbacks and there are benefits to it. Hymnody has a big benefit. It teaches the people, gets them involved. Maybe a drawback is that sometimes hymns can be a little bit, we got to sing 10 verses of this hymn and it becomes a little too much. Anthems are choir pieces that are beautiful and wonderful, but the drawback is that they don't always match up with the readings or the theme of the day, right? And so there's a difference between a liturgical choir that is enhancing the worship service and doing parts, uplifting parts in the service a little bit better maybe than the congregation since it's professional. That's something different than, well, let's just sing something nice and it's kind of like a show. So we won't want to go too far into the direction of this is entertainment, where I go, oh, that was really nice. The choir's up front, and that sounded really nice. Do we actually have a proclamation of the gospel? Do we actually think about the coming into the presence of God and all the rest of the things of worship that we've been talking about? Okay, so different genres we sort of already talked about. What I'd like to do next is do the chart on page 34 that talks about some of the different styles and eras in the history of worship music. The first one is the Old Testament. You're going to have temple singers and you're going to have a lot of psalms. So remember, we talked about the Psalms being the prayer book, but also the song book of the Old Testament. And so this is a little bit different because this is inspired word of God. But when you look at the Psalms, it goes through the whole range of human emotion. This is why it's such a beautiful prayer book, because it gives you words of feelings that maybe you couldn't articulate. It even talks to you about feelings you didn't know you had, right? And so it gives you the words of lament, my God, why have you forsaken me? It gives you the words of praise and joy. And so the Old Testament music was centered around psalms and the temple professional singers. The early church began with some congregational singing. So now we're going to have not just the psalms, but we're going to have hymns and spiritual songs. We're also going to have the beginning of liturgical canticles. Canticles just means a song, and liturgical canticles are the songs that we find in the Bible that are repeated in the worship service. We've already mentioned a bunch of them. The Sanctus, holy, holy, holy. The Gloria, glory to God in the highest and peace on earth, goodwill towards men. So these liturgical songs, not really like a hymn that we sing, but a liturgical song that does something and says something in the worship service. In the early church, the last thing I want you to know about this era, in the early church, songs were also used as catechetical aids and defenses. So sung creeds. And the opposite was true too. You had little ditties and songs that were used against Christianity, right? So you had songs that would make fun of Christianity, and then Christianity would respond with songs that would confess Christianity, and the children would learn this, and they would learn the faith by this, right? So early church, congregational singing, adding some hymns and liturgical canticles, but then these little ditties and catechetical aids that would teach and defend the faith over against songs that have been used against the Christian confession. I'm going to lump together the imperial, medieval, and Renaissance eras. The imperial era is when the church is now going to be in the Roman Empire, not only legal but favored, and then get into the medieval and Renaissance eras as two. We're now going to have an explosion of diversity in music. You're also going to have the rise of skilled choirs, but that is also going to be the diminishing of congregational participation in the music. One example would be Gregorian chant, named after Gregory the Great. And so this style of chant that could put all of these words to simple music. And the beauty of chant too is that you can take a chant tone and you can add anything to it, right? You don't have to have a poet come in and mix up the words of a text so that it matched the meter of a hymn tune. Rather, you could uplift any text with chant, and so it was very useful to do that. But it took somebody skilled to do that, right? And so even though it was beautiful and great and useful, again, diminishing the participation of the people, and that went along with medieval theology, where the priests are doing the worship stuff and you are just an observer. During the Reformation age, we are going to have congregational singing coming back like and being enhanced like never before. Never again, never before, and I'm afraid never again will you have as much congregational singing as in the Reformation. There was a mixture of Latin and the vernacular, so the vernacular being the language of the people. It was very catechetical in nature. It was used to teach. And so Martin Luther has written more hymns than just about any other Lutheran, maybe anybody else as well. And they were all about teaching the faith. So this was important at that era because nobody knew about the faith. The priests did the thing up there and nobody was really taught anything. And so music as education, teaching the faith, was the primary focus of the Reformation music scene. Then you have the radical reformers who had anti-music tendencies as well. All right. Then the next era I'm going to call the sweet spot. And what I mean by that is we're going to get into pietism later, which is going to be emotive and less objective. The sweet spot is where you're going to have both the good theology of the Reformation that teaches, but also emotion. So it's great that you have Martin Luther writing a hymn that teaches the catechism. And so he writes a hymn on the 10 commandments and there's 10 verses. Okay, that's fine. That teaches me something. But the human Christian existence is also about compassion and suffering. And Luther did write about that a little bit, but not as much as a person like Paul Gerhardt, who you see on your screen today. Paul Gerhardt took that good theology, but then he also brought in a correct amount of what we're going to call good pietism, good emotion. Now, Paul Gerhardt is interesting because he buried half his children, one of his wives, and during plagues in the 30 Years' War, he probably had a funeral every day in his parish. He lived in a time that we'll never see that. I mean, it would have to be disaster after our disaster in our world for us to have go through what Paul Gerhardt went through. And yet out of that crucible came some of the most beautiful poetry ever. Paul Gerhardt is an amazing poet. And he brought in the good theology with his suffering in this world and then put it on the hope of Christ and the resurrection. Just fantastic. So I call this the sweet spot because you have the good, solid objectivity of the Reformation, but it was also very, very emotional in a good way. So it is both subjective and objective. It is both about good theology and emotion. It's singing in the good times and the bad times. This is different than pietism. And remember what we talked about pietism as privileging the subjective feeling over the objective reality. And so music in the pietistic age is all going to be about me and my faith. And so instead of saying, this is what God has done, it's going to be about my faith. It's a turn inward. And so it's going to be emotion over good theology. It's going to be subjective over objective and largely positive over negative. And that's a problem because life is full of suffering and we need that. We need that compassion. We need to hear people who have been through those things and yet have hope, not in ourselves, but in Christ. So pietism kind of turned things in an inner way and in a subjective way, and that's sort of still with us today. Now, what are we going to do with modern church music? I think sometimes we fall into the trap of style over substance, right? And so it's more about, I like that tune rather than the substance. I think we've still are in the trap of positive over negative rather than the theology of the cross. It's a theology of glory. We are turning to more anthem choirs rather than liturgical choirs. And I wonder if there's a danger of leaving the congregation in the dust, because it's hard to sing. It's easy to sing hymns, but it's hard to sing more complicated music. So can we have a balance of the professional choir and the congregational singing? The danger is if we become passive, then church is just about entertainment, right? And so we are entertained and we're given a good moral lesson, and it's not really a participatory idea of coming into the presence of God and dining with him, coming into the presence of God as he should flick us away, but rather draws us into the story of Christ. Now, there is a historic reason for some of this, and that is after the Reformation and Renaissance, musicians could make a living outside of church music. So for a very long time, the church was the patron for music. And so music was going to be spiritual. But think about like Mozart and Beethoven, they could make a living without doing spiritual music. They still did spiritual music, but they could do it without it. And so ever since then, a talented musician is more likely going to do something that is secular rather than what is spiritual or ecclesiastical. You're just not going to make money in that. And so you couple that with a pietism and a radical reformation that downplayed music, and the church stopped funding music for a long time. I mean, it was still there, but it wasn't there like it was in the Reformation and medieval age. And so you have a dearth of musical talent, and you have a lack of funding in the church. And so if you go to a church and you open up the hymn book and you're like, why are we singing something from the 1600s or the 1700s? Can't we have something new and fresh? Well, part of it is because we didn't put our money where our mouth was, and we didn't take those beautiful texts and update the music. At the same time, I think that's changing. And in my lifetime, I've seen the change where money is being put more into the art and music of the church. And we are getting fresh music that's not just a cheap imitation of rock and roll or jazz or something like that, but it's actually new and fresh. And so I am actually quite optimistic about church music in the future. So please know the eras. Please be familiar with music stuff for the test, but hopefully this got you thinking a little bit that it's not just about style, but it has to be about substance. And how do you get people to participate in this? How do you teach, but also have the right sense of emotion when it comes to music?